Hello, welcome to the 2 p.m. slot of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Michelle Montano. I am the Communications and Policy Analyst at the partnership, and I am joined by my colleague, Samila. This year, the theme for the conference is Here for Housing, and it's our opportunity to convene, collaborate, and drive meaningful change to improve and expand housing affordability, creation, choice, and stability across our state. If you're sharing any content from the conference, please use the hashtag CAHC 2024 across all platforms to kind of keep the conversation findable. The session that we are here for today is called Mind the Gap, Connecticut's Housing Supply. And before we turn it over to our presenters, we want to thank our presenting sponsor, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our visionary sponsor, Wells Fargo, our champion sponsors, Liberty Bank, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Cohn Resnick, Trinity Financial, J. D'Amelia and Associates, and Robinson and Cole. And our foundation sponsors, M&T Bank, Hinkley Allen, Beacon Communities, FHL Bank Boston, Connecticut Investment Advisors, and Capital for Change. These sponsors' deep support help us make the conference happen each year and keep it free for everyone to attend, which we love. And then finally, this session is sponsored by Elm City Communities, the housing authorities of New Haven. Last but not least, just a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded. So please do keep your microphone on mute unless, the presenters are asking for questions. If you have any tech issues, please message myself or Samila directly and we can try to get you sorted out. And if you have for the Q&A session, please feel free to submit any questions into the chat. And myself and the presenters will be monitoring to make sure that we address all those questions. And post-session, please complete a session feedback survey by clicking on the megaphone icon in the lobby. We really, really appreciate this feedback. We really try to make the conference better and better each year. And we can only do that when we hear from you about what you like and what you don't like. So please do feel free to complete that survey. And with that, I will turn it over to Marcus to get us started.
Hi, everybody. Marcus Smith with the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. I want to thank you for joining us today. I know you have a lot of choices at this hour, so I appreciate you choosing us. And again, thank you to Michelle and Samila and the entire partnership crew for creating space for conversations like the one we're about to have. We have three brilliant, beautiful housing nerds with us in this hour. I won't go into the whole bios for everybody because that's all in the tool, the Zoom tool. So go find it there if you want to find out more about who we're talking about today. So just a quick run of show. We're first going to hear from my colleague at CHFA, Andrew Bolger, and then who's going to give us that foundational perspective of data and housing and what we know and what we don't know. And then we'll go over to SN and Johnny to hear a little bit about how they're using data to drive the work that they're doing in their specific places in their organizations. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. So as Michelle said, please drop your questions in the chat. We're going to do the best we can to leave as much time as possible to get to the questions. So if something does kind of spark curiosity, drop it in the chat and don't wait till the end and try to remember it so we can get to it. So with that, turning it over to Andrew, off you go.
Sure. Thank you, Marcus. So this session is called Mind the Gap. And what we're going to do is take kind of a deep dive into the Connecticut's housing gap. You may have all been hearing about this 90,000 number in the news and media lately, but we're going to kind of explain what that actually is and then talk about how CHFA is using it, but also how other practitioners, SN and Johnny, are using it in their work to inform best policies and practices. So the gap analysis comes from our now one-year-old housing needs assessment, or H&A for short. And what it is basically a deep dive report into kind of the key housing trends in the state. It is intended to serve as a resource for us, for CHFA, and for our partners, you all on the call here, to make informed, data-driven decisions with as close to real-time data as possible. It looks at trends in demographics, housing stock, sales and inventory trends coming out of the pandemic, looks at the type of markets, and obviously looks at the housing gap analysis itself. It incorporates data from HUD, Census, CoStar, Zillow, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and several other sources there. And then it's available there at the link at the bottom as well. And I will also point out we just published a housing needs assessment dashboard that has a live and interactive version of the kind of major data lines you'll find in the report, and that is updated by yours truly on a monthly basis. So with that, kind of the key findings we found in the H&A was we've been seeing statewide an increase in household formation combined with lagging new housing production, putting pressure on the existing housing stock that's in the state. And we face a quote unquote gap of roughly 91,000 units for the lowest income renters in the state. And we see also a for sale inventory shortage, that meaning just what's available on Zillow or Realtor.com, for example, for sale. We see that number has come down dramatically since the pre-pandemic time. That combined with increased demand and competition for homes and listings and increased prices have really created significant difficulties for especially first-time home buyers. That combined with what the Fed is doing to counter inflation in terms of interest rate increases has really confounded affordability challenges across the board for all home buyers. And then due in part due to this hot single family market and the household growth formation or household growth trend we've been seeing, we saw rental vacancy rates drop significantly during the pandemic, and they've been remained low since. And we've also seen year-over-year rent growth numbers tick up across the state. And so that really putting a pressure on the existing housing market. But we're here to talk today about the gap analysis, and we can't talk about housing units without talking about the demand and the people that actually live in them. So the narrative that Connecticut has really told itself for the better part of 15 years or so is that our population is either flat or increasing just a little bit. And therefore, why would we need to build more housing? And that kind of narrative about the population does hold for the most part. Over the 2022 to 2017 period, we saw an increase of about 0.5% statewide. And you look across the different regions here, different planning regions, we're increasing in other areas, we're flat in some, and we're decreasing in some other areas. But what is for the most part universally true is that we're seeing in green an increase in the number of households. The census defines a household as anytime someone occupies a new housing unit. So the typical example being a recent high school or college graduate who is living with their parents, gets their first job, moves into their first apartment. That original household of 3 is now a household of 2 and another household of 1. And so that's all great. That's what we want to see. It's an economic driver. It's really what we want to see, but when we're not pairing it with new units to meet that demand, that's where some pressure on the market comes in. So this is looking at just permitted units back to 1966 by basically the size of the building that they're in. And what you see is that the vast majority of our construction happened before 1990. There's some ebbs and flows in the middle of the century, but we were producing anywhere between 25,000 and 10,000 units a year. And then in the 90s, we were hovering around, say, 10,000 units on average. And then the Great Recession hits in the middle of the 2000s. And we see a pretty dramatic drop in permits for specifically 1 unit construction in those green bars there, but also across the board. And we're still well below where we were before the Great Recession hit us. And so again, really the demand combined with the lack of construction is where we get into the gap analysis and the pressure being put on the market. So what is the gap analysis? It's derived from an American Planning Association Planning Advisory Service Memo, or PAS. The goal of the gap analysis is to estimate the number of additional units by tenure, owners or renters, income and geography that are needed for the inventory to match the incomes of the households in a specific area. It uses a comprehensive housing affordability strategy data from HUD, or CHAS for short, which is essentially custom tabulations of American Community Survey estimates. And HUD and others use it to plan, distribute grants, and in this case, estimate housing need. You'll see in a moment, it's not a production target, but rather it kind of points to where additional units and income supports might be best served. And then you see the formula on the bottom. The gap's calculated by taking the number of households minus the total number of affordable on the market units, taking into consideration the number of units that are occupied by other income households. And so visually, what that looks like is this. And so this is the rental gap for 0 to 30 AMI renters across the state. On the left, you have the number of households, rental households that fall into this income bucket, shaded by whether or not they are cost burdened in dark blue and not cost burdened in that light blue section. And on the right, you have the total number of affordable and available units to this income group. And they're shaded by whether or not they are occupied by households that are at the appropriate income level, i.e. that are earning 0 to 30% AMI in this case, or in light green, whether they are occupied by households earning a higher income than 0 to 30% AMI. And so the gap is calculated by first the difference in the height of these two bars. So that the first piece is that kind of that dashed line box. And then the second is the number of units that are occupied by, in this case, higher income households. And so that's where that 91,000 unit number comes from. And so when we zoom out to the statewide, what we see is kind of a squeezing effect across the rental market. So you have those same two bars divvied up by, again, 0 to 30% AMI, 31 to 50, 51 to 80, and then 80% or above 80% on the right there. And you see that on the left-hand side, there's an outright shortage of units for renters earning 0 to 30% AMI. We covered that. But on the right-hand side, there's also an outright shortage of units for renters earning above 80% AMI. And so what that then leads to is then folks, renters basically having to rent up and also rent down. Rent up because on the 0 to 30% AMI, there's no other option. But for renters earning above 80% AMI, there's also a kind of lack of units in that price range, but also, no one wants to really max out their housing budget all the time. They're going to seek a less expensive option in the kind of middle of the market between units affordable to 31 to 80% AMI. And so while you look in the middle of the market, there's actually on the right, those two right-hand bars, there are actually more units than there are households in these two income buckets, but they're being essentially crowded out by renters earning lower incomes and higher incomes, and that's causing stress across the market. And just to put kind of numbers on it, so I mentioned that 91,000 number is the gap for the 0 to 30% renters. We've also find that just over a third of the units priced for the lowest income renters in the state are occupied by renters at higher incomes. Then we find that the lowest income renters are occupying about a quarter of the units priced in the middle of the market, and some are even occupying 14% are occupying units priced for 80% and above. So really, really stretching that housing budget. We also find that renters at the higher end of the market are occupying 11% of the units for the lowest income renters in the state, and about a third of the units for that middle of the market. So you see kind of evidence of a mixed match of units based on that kind of supply and balance at the ends of the market. The other thing that this methodology and data lets us do is look at local and regional trends using this methodology as well. You see here we have the gap number for 0 to 30% AMI divvied up by councils of government. So really getting us a lens at various local trends. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to, I believe, Johnny, who's going to talk about what they're doing with this methodology in New Haven.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Can you all still hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, like Andrew mentioned, my name is Johnny Shively, and I am the Housing Policy Manager for Elm City Communities in New Haven. And I first got in touch with CHFA because this year I helped to author the annual report for New Haven's Affordable Housing Commission, which outlines the state of New Haven's development pipeline and provides recommendations for our elected officials. And as I worked on that report, I wanted to get a grasp on the need for housing in New Haven so that our city can set some really well-informed goals and get a better understanding of what affordable housing strategies are most appropriate for our residents. Next slide, please, Andrew. So let's go ahead and dive into the data that we shared in our report. So first, we'll look at a simplified version of the data that CHFA pulled together for us. If you look at this chart, you'll see the gap across 4 different segments of New Haven's rental market. So again, as Andrew mentioned, that's the difference between the number of households in a particular income range and the number of units that are affordable for those households. And so for this chart, a surplus of units is represented by a bar above the line, and a shortage of units is represented by a bar below that 0 line. And what you can see is that New Haven actually, I guess, similar to the state of Connecticut as a whole, has a surplus of units affordable for families earning between 31 and 80% AMI. So in the 31 to 50% AMI range, our city actually has a surplus of almost 2,000 units. And in the 51 to 80% AMI range, we have a surplus of over 10,000 units. Our shortages, meanwhile, are at the far ends of the housing market, much like the state of Connecticut. So for households earning 0 to 30% AMI, there is a shortage of about 6,500 units. And for the households earning 81% AMI and over, at the right side of that graph, there's a shortage of almost 4,000 units. So what's the main takeaway from this graphic? The chart helps us understand immediately where the gaps are in our city's housing market. But to better understand sort of the ripple effects of those gaps, let's look at the data a different way. Thank you. So this chart, which is similar to what you've already seen, reflects exactly the same data with households shown on the left in blue and units shown on the right in green and yellow. And those bars you saw on the last slide represent the difference between the blue bar and the green and yellow bar. So you can see, again, there's a shortage of units at 0 to 30% AMI, a surplus of units 31 to 50% AMI, another surplus of units 51 to 80% AMI, and a shortage of units at 80% AMI and over. And what's cool about this chart is if you look at the green and yellow bars, you can see not only how many units exist for households within that income range, but also who is inhabiting those units. So for units affordable to households earning 51 to 80% AMI, we can see that in New Haven, relatively few of them are being inhabited by households that are actually within that income range. So the dark green band in that 51 to 80% AMI unit bar. Instead, many of those units are being inhabited by higher income households, which means households earning more than 80% AMI, shown in light green. And the majority of units are actually being inhabited by lower income households, shown in yellow. So that's households earning below 50% AMI. It's also worth noting that all of those yellow households are paying more than they can truly afford for housing. And so we can also see the same thing for units that are affordable to households earning 31 to 50% AMI. Some of those units are being inhabited by households within that income range, shown here in dark green, but many units are being rented by households with higher and lower incomes, shown here in light green and yellow, respectively. And so for me, this serves as strong evidence of something that academic experts have been telling us for years, and that Andrew just mentioned as well, which is that a shortage of units at both the high end of the market and the low end of the market are pushing those renters into more affordable units, making it more difficult for households in our sort of middle income ranges to find an affordable place to live. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Andrew. So how can these data help to inform New Haven's affordable housing strategies? Well, to me, they suggest that we should consider as a city building units that are affordable for families at both ends of the rental spectrum, where our greatest shortages are. So some policy ideas and other strategies from around the country, it could mean amending our city's inclusionary zoning ordinance to generate more set-aside units in that deeply affordable 0 to 30% AMI range. It could mean coming up with creative financing tools for mixed income development. One example, which we heard about this morning, is the revolving loan fund that has allowed Montgomery County to create deeply affordable housing with 0 public subsidy. And it could also mean investigating different kinds of housing that are naturally affordable for households at the low end of our income range, like single room occupancy units. But whatever strategies we use, I think that these data make it extremely clear that we need to be building units for our lowest income households alongside folks at the high end of our rental market. So thank you to Andrew and the whole team for putting these data together. It's been incredibly helpful to have them and to be able to share them with our local policymakers.
Great. Thanks, John. I think SN, you're up next.
Thank you, Andrew. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Savannah Nicole Villalba. I go by SN, and I'm the Community Planning Director at the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments. And here at NVCOG, we've had the pleasure of working with Andrew and Marcus and the CHFA data team for about 2.5 years with this data set, which has
If you say so.
it's been very wonderful. And so we'll briefly cover how NVCOG has been minding the gap with the assistance of CHFA, which we greatly appreciate. So next slide, please. So I like to provide a bit of information about what a Council of Governments is. It's not something that everyone is familiar with, but it is how parts of the housing needs assessment are organized. So just to give a brief overview, we're a voluntary association of 19 municipalities in West Central Connecticut. And so for our organization and the Councils of Governments, our board are the chief elected officials of the region. So the 19 chief elected officials of our region help guide policy and planning efforts in our region as they relate to our role as a state designated Council of Governments and a federally designated metropolitan planning organization. Next slide, please. And our organization has the pleasure of working with our member municipalities on a variety of efforts across the transportation and environmental data and GIS lenses, but I'm here today to talk about the work we do with housing. So that's just a brief overview of who we are. And so because of the information we've been able to utilize with the CHAS data, we have seen changes in our programmatic responses at NVCOG and as well as our policy responses. So I'll briefly touch upon both, and I know we'll get into them further in the question and answers. So for the regional use, we have found having access to the CHAS data and the ability to create these housing needs assessments invaluable for our member municipalities. It's an additional service we can provide to those 19 communities so that they can better understand their current housing market. And so we've had the opportunity of completing 6 housing needs assessments in those 2 years for the municipalities identified on the screen. And the information for our housing needs assessments for some of these communities are accessible on our website. But thankfully, our team, Richard Crowther Jr. and Phoebe Plouffe, have been wonderful in helping us churn out the housing needs assessment. So that's where a lot of our efforts have been thus far. But next slide, please. We really see the housing needs assessment and the CHAS data as the baseline to truly planning for our region in terms of housing. And so it has changed what we intend to do to engage in housing policy and housing programming over the next few years in our organization. We initially did a regional housing profile, which was helpful, but was more of a resuscitation of housing data that we had access to. We are now working with help from CHFA and other partners on a regional housing needs assessment. So it will provide a little bit more of just a focus on our region, and we'll pull some of those tips and tricks from the CHFA housing needs assessment. But our goal is to publish that in the upcoming year. And we want to use that analysis. We want to use the information that we receive from our regional housing needs assessment to set our regional housing plan, which will provide policies and recommendations that we have to address the housing gap that we are aware exists through the information that Andrew had previously shared with us. So I will stop there so that we can get into questions, but you can find us. My communications team would be mad at me if I didn't share how to find us. So thank you, Andrew.
So with that, Marcus, do we want to do some quick Q&A?
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions, but before we do, I think maybe we can kind of touch on, there's a question in the chat here or in the Q&A widget. The question is, isn't the answer to allow developers to build more housing for people of all income types so that the higher income people aren't pushed into bidding up the price of the older housing units? And I know Johnny, you touched a little bit on this on your closing remark as we transitioned. So I think that the answer is yes, right? Yes. But I'll kind of open it up to everybody, SN and Andrew included. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree. The answer is yes. Kind of all the above is great, but what I should have mentioned and pointed out was the cost burden numbers, specifically for renters earning 0 to 50% AMI. It's roughly a quarter of all renters earning between that income level are cost burden. So the most acute need, immediate need is there. Over the long run, I think producing more housing at all income levels would lower the pressure amongst the entire market. But if we're talking in the near term, devoting resource towards those renters might be most useful.
See, Johnny came off of mute. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is absolutely yes. For me, it's a both and, right? So it's about creating, like you said, housing across all aspects of the rental market, which means building housing at the lowest income section of the market too. And I'm really inspired again by examples like what's going on in Montgomery County, where market rate units are being developed, and they can help to cross subsidize some deeply affordable units. So those deeply affordable units are available today for families who need them, and those market rate units are being developed to help remove pressure from the market, and to get those rental chains going that we know loosen up the market in other sections. So to me, yes, it's about creating more housing at all across all segments of the market, including the lowest income segments.
I have another question in the chat. How can developers help get more housing for all budgets when zoning is so restrictive? And does the legislature have an appetite to address this? So take the first bit first. I think maybe in SN, you kind of probably deal with more zoning than any of us. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So to touch upon it, I think that that's a really great question. And I think that's where the housing needs assessments can be really helpful on the local level, is that a lot of times when you're working with a land use commission and you just say, I'd like to see more affordable housing built, that means something from a housing policy perspective, or it might mean something from a housing advocacy perspective. And we're hearing us talk today. Marcus affectionately called us housing nerds, and I think we all would. But when we're talking about that, we're talking in area median income bands. We're talking about tenure. But a zoning commission and a local commission with the ability to make decisions, often they need a larger rationale when they're trying to make a regulatory change. And so these housing needs assessments, whether it be at the regional or the local level, the way that we've done for our member municipalities, or Johnny has done for New Haven, they really help those decision makers see where that gap lies. And so zoning can be seen as restrictive until decision makers have the information they need for their staff or their communities to encourage them to make changes. And so making zoning regulations that touch upon the population that Andrew's bringing up, 30 to 50, that's not what 830G covers. And so we only know that that gap exists because of the CHAS data and the housing needs assessments. And so I think that the zoning can be used to really target your affordable housing policies at the local level, but that's a difficult thing to ask any local decision-making body to do without something like a housing needs assessment to help them support why they're making the policy change that you're recommending.
And so in terms of that second part of that question, does the legislature have an appetite to address this? Does anybody have an appetite to answer that question?
I mean, just based on the conversation with the majority leader and the other legislators from yesterday, it seems like there's some momentum building towards that, but we'll see this session.
Yeah. Yep. Question from Greg Ugaldi. Key data for comparisons is construction cost at each level. Where are our dollars best allocated? And this is something that CHFA, I can say, has talked about quite a bit. You know, from the bird's eye level, total development costs for deeply affordable housing might look outsized, but if you strip away the soft costs that go into it, and you just look at the hard costs, it's quite comparable to other housing that's built for other income bands. But you know, it's hard to you can't just kind of cancel out the soft costs because they're instrumental or they're fundamental to getting affordable housing built in some way. So, any thoughts on that, panel? You know, is there a better place to put our limited dollars or limited resources?
I mean, I think it goes back to the point about the immediate cost burden need, right? I mean, if we're talking about use of public dollars in the short run, getting those cost burden numbers down among the lowest income renters would probably be the biggest bang for our buck. But you know, the work that SN is doing in terms of the longer term planning at the local level is invaluable, really.
I think another question that I have is, you know, what kinds of dollars are we talking about? What financial products are we discussing? So if we're talking about a project, a development project that has the potential to provide some return, that could be a great investment opportunity for low interest loans, whereas possibly subsidies are more appropriately invested into deeply affordable units that won't create as much return. But again, we're seeing creative examples all over the country of how people are moving these different kinds of financial products into developments that mix housing across different income levels. But I think thinking about the financial product really changes my answer for that question.
Yeah, I think there's a question here, and I think, Andrew, this might be for you. It kind of speaks to the relative lag that we see in housing data. Like what conclusions can we draw on the data given the time frame that it covers? So the question is, tenants are seeing rental cost increases dramatically over short periods of time. Do you anticipate these changes dramatically impacting the data and subsequent analysis from the HNA?
That's a fantastic question because Jazz data itself, it's repackaged American Community Survey data, which in itself is lagged a bit. And so right now we just have data, the Jazz data through 2021. So my kind of way of going about it is the gap analysis is kind of the baseline, right? And then you can use more live data. We use CoStar, which is basically the back end of apartments.com. You can use that to then supplement there afterwards. So I think it's really crucial when telling a complete story to have this as the baseline, but also supplement it with more recent and closer to real-time data as possible.
So a question for SN. You mentioned that the NVCOG has been working on assessment for 2 years. Can you talk more about the resources and the skills needed to conduct the analysis, and any tips for those who want to conduct one for their city or town or region?
Sure. So thank you, Heidi. And Heidi works for the Capital Region Council of Governments. And so, Heidi, it was very difficult the first time that we did this. We did our first housing needs assessment before we knew that CHFA was a resource that we could work with there. And I'll be honest, I read those PAS memos, and it took me and our data, now our GIS and data coordinator, about 3 months to get through the CHAS data and to put this analysis together. And I'm a firm believer of seeing progress in work products means you're learning, but I'm looking forward to going back and redoing the housing needs assessment for the first community that allowed us to do it for them, because the data is unwieldy. And if you don't know what you're looking for in the CHAS data, it is a beautiful and wonderful and incredible and powerful data set, but it can be misused, and that makes me fearful for the local and the regional and the state level, are the ways in which if you're not sure, you don't have someone you can verify that you're using it correctly with, it's very easy to misinterpret what you're actually looking at. And so it took me, as someone who went to planning school and took housing classes and has a relatively strong quantitative background, and our GIS and data person who is a quantitatively focused person, to do the first one. And now we work very closely with Andrew and Marcus, who I call my data wizards. I love the way that they can help us. And so it is, my recommendation is, if you are going to do this, you'll want buy-in from your chief elected official or your executive director. We were lucky at MVCOG. Our executive director saw the importance of this from the beginning and has supported our organizations and our staff's housing work. So when we said it's going to take us 3-4 months to do this, he said, if that's going to lead to a good product for our member municipality, I want you to do it. Now it takes us about a month to get through it, but it takes commitment and understanding from your decision makers that this isn't something you do in a second. This is something you need to really look at, you need to examine, and CHFA's help. I don't want to put them on the spot, but they're really helpful in helping with getting clean data that you can use. But the report we write, it took us many iterations of going back and forth with Andrew to say, are we representing the data correctly here? Is this a fair summation of the narrative that we're trying to get at? And so if someone wanted to create one for their municipality, my recommendation would be, and Heidi, this is where I apologize, go to your Council of Governments, because I think that at our level, we just have more capacity to take on this sort of longer effort that maybe a municipal planner who has multiple commissions doesn't have the bandwidth to do at the level that it needs to be done. And if it's being done at the regional level or the municipal one, if it's an economic development coordinator or planner or someone in the municipal staff that's understands what they're about to take on, connect with CHFA. Be sure that you're not misusing the data, because if you do, it's going to be really hard to regain your community's trust if it's not correct when you're ready to put out that information. But for anyone in our region who is here or may not know that we can do this for you, I'm your point of contact. So please reach out so we can increase beyond 6. But be prepared. It's a really awesome resource, but it's not something that I think any community or any region should take lightly. It has a lot of power behind it.
And then on the flip side of that, it's useful for us to have the local perspective, right? We're obviously state focused. And so, you know, if we're producing something for a given municipality and something looks off, we want to know why that might be.
So what's the perception? I'm pulling on Kayla's question in the chat. So what's been the reception? And both Johnny and SN, I know you've both worked with local folks or regional folks. So how have they received your analysis of the housing needs as you see it in the data? Maybe go to SN first, then to Johnny.
Sure. So on the local level, I think we've seen a variety of responses to the question about the data frame. We get questions because we were using 2020 CHAS data. People were questioning if that's what we should be using, understanding what we went through in 2020. But the response we give is, this is the best data we have. This is the most nuanced data we have. And so I think Marcus said it earlier, and I want to echo that. It's one piece of the picture. So the CHAS data, using the housing needs assessments using the CHAS data, shouldn't be the only way in which you consider your municipality or your region's housing market. It's one tool that you build upon with community input or market input or whatever else it may be, but it's a really great starting place. And that's what Andrew was talking about. That's that baseline. But we have seen chief elected officials be incredibly responsive to the data. I think that one thing that is really powerful about doing these local level analyses is our community members know their communities best. And so when we're able to show them this information, where we're saying there's a squeeze from the higher income households to the lower income units, that aligns with what they're hearing from their neighbors or their family members, or as they're looking for their own units. And so we actually have one of our chief elected officials requested, after seeing our housing needs assessment, we drafted data points for them to talk about during their state of the town. So we're seeing chief elected officials be really open to finding ways in which they can articulate their housing conditions currently to their broader community. We're also seeing chief elected officials encourage us to work with their municipal staff to get to, as Johnny was talking about, what sort of zoning regulations could we suggest? What sort of municipal ordinance policies for certain households should they be considering? So we're seeing that. And then on the community side, our planners love it. They tell us all the time that it's so great to have someone that's willing to geek out and give them this level of information. And their land use commissioners, they really, really like the data set. And I think that's the place where they sharpen me every single time I present the data. They help us do it better. We used to do it in one meeting, and our commissioners were really kind, but 2 hours about a lot of data is not the best way to get this information across. So we now have a model where we ask them to commit to 2 meetings, and we have way more productive conversations. And we've had land use commissioners, when it's just a planning commission, say, we need to get the zoning commission involved. We need to do this. We need to do a joint meeting where we share this information. We can only go so far. We've heard communities suggest ways in which they could modify their plans of conservation and development with this information. But we're hoping to work with more communities to implement more specific zoning regulations with the information that they've received, so that they have better informed decision making as they set local policy.
Great, thanks. That's an end. And Johnny, what about you? How's things gone in your area?
Yeah, I've received really warm feedback around these data. I mean, local change makers seem to find them really useful, especially for kind of 2 specific reasons. One, I think it's just helpful in New Haven to have one more way of defining our need, right? There's a lot of different ways of understanding New Haven's housing needs, but these are really concrete numbers that we can look at to talk about, what kind of housing production is needed in our city. So I think having that sort of concrete analysis is really useful for folks. And then another way that it's been useful is in really clarifying, like SN said, how those market pressures are affecting our city, how a lack of units at the top end of the rental market is causing folks to rent down. I think this is a thing that we've been talking about as a city for long enough that folks kind of have an idea of how it works, but maybe aren't exactly clear on the extent to which it's taking place. And so having these hard numbers, I mean, it's super helpful for us as a city to be able to understand the degree of that effect. So those are a couple of pieces of feedback I've received around these numbers.
That's great. So another question in the Q&A widget. So as the LIHTC is a federal program, is there any discussion with taking these findings to the regulatory agencies on this program to avoid people who are making over the maximum income at 100% LIHTC property who are entitled to remain in the affordable program? So I think the question is this data being used to maybe fine tune or improve programs at the federal level? I personally don't know of any. But I don't know, Andrew, have you come across any studies or anything like that?
Not this methodology specifically, but the National Low Income Housing Coalition puts out very similar estimates, and I know they're used pretty widely in Congress. But in terms of a specific programmatic change, I don't know that I could point to one.
Yep. So another question, are there any concerns that inclusionary zoning requirements lower the number of units that get built? Most studies show that inclusionary zoning requirements reduce overall construction. Not 100% familiar with anything like that. Anything, Johnny, you came off mute.
I just came off mute because I know I brought this up specifically. I mean, of course, that's a concern. And I think something that we know about inclusionary zoning and development more broadly is it's so context dependent. And so those are the right questions for our local elected officials to be asking, right? We have an inclusionary zoning ordinance in place. It has added some affordable units to our pipeline already, but are they the units at the levels of affordability that we need? Are there ways that we might consider amending our ordinance? And how will that impact the development market in New Haven? I think the next step is it could be for our local elected officials to have that conversation. But of course, how it impacts the market is a concern.
We've got a few minutes left. So one question I had, Andrew, you deal mostly with the data than any of us. Any challenges that I mean, you don't want to present this as like an avenue of green lights here. Everything's rosy, it's easy peasy. Any challenges you're having with the data, the things that you wished you could answer but you can't, or it's just, there are some barriers to using this data. It's not necessarily a Swiss Army knife, as it were.
Yeah, the main thing, and SN mentioned it, is it's pretty unwieldy. It's a very large and complex data set with hundreds of different fields, so you kind of need to know what you're looking for. We developed a tool internally where we can just kind of plug in the updated data every year, and it'll automatically update the estimates. So that's been useful for us. But actually, I know SN has encountered some issues with working with smaller towns specifically.
Yeah. And also the CHFA data has so much information that we just haven't even gotten into. It has about like the adequacy of units. It has information about cost burden by age and it's powerful. It's really beautiful, but to figure out how to use it right, you need 6 months of that being a lot of what you're doing. But yes, so for our communities that have smaller household sizes, the CHFA data gives you information on total households, and then it gives you cost burden information as its own like cell. So it'll say for how many 0 to 30 AMI renter households there are. But it sums up. So it'll give you that. It'll give you 31 to 50, 50 to 80, greater than 80. And it'll give you a total number of households that are renting. And so what we were seeing in our region, because we showed the information graphically and then tabularly, that when we were using the individual breakdown sums that the CHFA data was giving in our smaller household size communities, that it wasn't aligning with the total households, or same thing with the cost burden, where it's say cost burden by AMI group, what would be the total that it had for total cost burden or total severely cost burdened households. And so when we were showing the information, there's always, I joke about it, but it's really important in disseminating this information. There's always one member of a local commission who's really good at fast math, and they're looking at the report to check the numbers as you're talking it through with them. And the second the numbers don't align up, you lose trust in that community, because you're supposed to be showing them something that is validated and they see it as empirical. And we couldn't figure out for a while why the numbers weren't aligning. But we were able to figure it out, and it is on the CHFA website. And if anyone wants to see it or go down the data hole with us, we would be more than happy to share. But Andrew said it earlier, the CHFA data is a reorganization of ACS data, but it gives such a granular piece of information that it rounds in a particular way to protect household information. And so it rounds wonkily. And so when we were looking at the numbers, it rounds on each of those individual household estimates, and it's rounding separately on the totals. And so we were seeing, based on the rounding schema, the difference between the total number of each individual AMI group when you added that up and the number that they gave as the total was in about the range that it would make sense if it was a rounding error. but that's just not that's an acceptable answer for a policy person. That's an acceptable answer for an academic. That's not an acceptable answer from a community that's already a little bit distrustful of the information you're giving them. So we had to make a decision about accuracy or preciseness, and our communities wanted preciseness. But if you get stuck there, call Andrew, call us, and we can help, because I bet we've been there.
Great, thanks everybody. And I did miss, so only in this conversation will you hear the phrase rounding schema. So I appreciate SM bringing that to us. The one question we didn't get to, and I think we'll maybe phrase as like a yes or no, is Andrew, is the gap analysis figure of 91,000 a production target
No,
that we should be using?
it's not.
Okay, thank
Definitely
you.
not.
Just want to make sure that's out there.
Yeah.
It is not a production unit target, so just make sure, folks, as you're interpreting and reading the data and sharing it around, we want to make sure that's very clear. But I see, Michelle, you came on. I just want to thank you again for the time. Really appreciate the engagement of this conversation from everybody. And again, I dropped a link in the chat for any more information on the HNA. Check out LinkedIn page, and one more last plug for Michelle, who helped us tremendously working with the partnership to create these really cool interactive videos that we shared out on social over the last month or so. So check those out if you get a chance. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Marcus, and thank you to all of you wonderful presenters. Just want to say we have a few more sessions set to kick off at 3 o'clock, and then we are looking forward to seeing all of you who registered to come to our in-person reception at the Lyceum in Hartford. That starts at 5. It's not too late to register for that. You can buy tickets at the door. So if you want to join us last minute, please feel free to come. Thank you again, and we will see you all soon.